Joining us here for this panel discussion on new potential with emerging innovative project types. I had to look at the title to make sure I got those three keywords in the correct order. I'm excited to moderate today's panel to talk about different project types and the pathways to developing protocols or methodologies for those practice types and changes to eventually generate carbon credits and what that is perceived or how those are perceived in the market by buyers or other parties. I'm McKenzie Smith. I'm Associate Director of Strategic Implementation at the Climate Action Reserve. I oversee our agriculture sector. I support our industrial work, but more broadly, I work on our policy files as it relates to topics like the ICVCM, but more specific to this conversation, I help lead our strategy for new protocol developments, whether it's adaptations or updates or new developments altogether, working with the technical team on that. I will let each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into some questions and discussion. So I'll turn it over, Robert, maybe to you first.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Parkhurst, and I have a consulting company, Sierra View Solutions, and we work at the intersection of agriculture, environmental markets, and policy. We help everyone from small startups to nonprofits, large corporations, the federal government to develop and research carbon credits in the agriculture and food space.
Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you to Climate Action Reserve for putting this on. My name is Reid Calhoun. I am the CEO of ClimateWells. We are a methodology and project developer focused on the early decommissioning of oil and gas wells across the U.S. We have active methodologies on a couple registries and are working to develop a methodology with Climate Action Reserve, hopefully soon going to public comment. But yeah, we focus on trying to shut down oil fields earlier, often decades earlier if possible, and focus on the methane reductions that we can create through those projects.
Hello, I'm Elsy Alvarado. I'm the Director of Project Relations at Cool Effect. Cool Effect is a nonprofit organization. We are mainly like a broker. We buy and sell carbon credits. And the goal or the mission of Cool Effect is to help project developers around the world place their carbon credits with buyers, either for spot buys or multi-year contracts.
Great, thanks everyone. So I thought we'd kind of flow through a few questions from different project types into protocol or methodology development, and then into some perceptions of different credit types in the market. So that'll be the general flow. And yeah, I first wanted to start off by asking our panelists that, given the recent growing attention on super pollutants, I think that obviously continues here at this year's NACW conference. We see that coming out and emerging in discussions. Of course, we also see a lot of nature-based discussions, whether it's biomass burial or enhanced rock weathering or new practices for agriculture work. There's obviously too, like technology removals that continue to be discussed and gain attention. So I just wanted to start at a really high level and ask our panelists what types of projects they're talking about the most in their roles. So start, Elsy, maybe with you.
So, well, first of all, it's exciting to see the different types coming out. We do review them, and I'm not the one that reviews them, but my team reviews them. And we have seen a lot of rice methodology coming in, soil coming in, and those two are now we're being discussing in general. Also, landfill gas is always a talk. And especially if the methodologies keeps on improving. It depends on the registry too, like every registry will have a different methodology with a different type of new project. We're seeing a lot of recovery and destruction of HFCs. Those are exciting. And one that we are looking into is the livestock waste. So all these are mainly super pollutants, which has a big impact on the environment. So we're excited about that.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting to hear how things are being characterized both from the emission source, like methane. Okay, rice methane is under the agriculture sector, but then you have methane from industrial work. So there's sort of two ways to slice the same conversation in a way where, are you talking about methane or are you talking about a sector type, industrial or agriculture? So I find that interesting. I don't know, Reid, if you had anything from your...
Yeah, it's funny, we're here to talk about emerging and new methodologies, and I think super pollutant and landfill gas methodologies were some of the very first in the carbon markets, which speaks to consistent quality and updates of methodologies over time. If you look at methane credit purchases and super pollutant credit purchases, I mean, the big one is landfill gas. I mean, probably something like 70 to 80% of all super pollutant purchases and retirements are attributed to landfill gas. And that is because it's a massive problem. It is clear to measure, and it is clear and easy to verify that a project's been done, and they pencil out in the economics. So, like, talk about a success case as it relates to super pollutants and landfill gas. There are new HFC methodologies that are coming out from a number of different registries. We're always excited to see that because refrigerants are so potent and such a problem. Again, highly measurable, super easy to verify, kind of common sense, low-hanging fruit methodologies. The newest ones in super pollutants that we like to keep an eye on, and the ones that relate to our work, are fossil fuel generation facilities, trying to get them retired early. So as you can imagine, we have a bunch of old coal mines, old coal-fired power plants, old oil wells, old natural gas-fired power plants. In their last 10 or 20 years, the emissions attributed to the amount of revenue that they generate kind of skyrockets. And so if you can take the last 5 or 10 years off of a fossil fuel generator, you can create this really additional, highly verifiable emission reduction. So Gold Standard has issued a methodology for the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. I think Vera has VM42 that just came out similarly, and we're working with Climate Action Reserve on retiring oil and gas wells early. So I'm very interested to see the methane reductions that are driven by shutting down some of these aging facilities earlier.
So we started with landfill, but actually the first super pollutant protocol came about 2 years before that, and that was livestock. So that was developed in about 2007. Right now, there is, I think, only 1 or 2 active livestock project on any of the registries, whereas most of the credits from that have gone into the low carbon fuel standard. So we're starting to look at how do you broaden beyond that. All of the livestock protocols are focused on biogas control systems, and so digesters. But if you look at that part, that is less than half of all the methane that's generated in California. So half the methane in California is generated out of one end of the cow. The other half is generated out of the other end of the cow. And literally, California's methane, those are the 2 largest sources of it. And so one of the challenges is that the quantification is only focused on the digester for a very long time. And there are activities you can do prior to any of that manure getting into the digester. You can separate the solids. You can manage the liquids. And by putting those practices in place, you can actually reduce the volatile solids that end up in the digester. So I've worked with a company, they're actually here in the room, Athian, to develop an alternative manure management protocol, which is based off of the California Department of Food and Ag's Alternative Manure Management Practices program, to create that into a crediting opportunity. And I think that's really exciting, and that's one way to get at the methane. The other is looking at feed additives, things like Rumensin, Bovaer. There's some other natural things that you can feed seaweed, cashews, things like that, that can actually reduce the methane that is generated by cows. There's only one that is actually approved by FDA, and there is, Athian also has a protocol around that. I'll also say and give a plug to the rice methane. That was a protocol that was originally developed by the Reserve in 2011, one of those years, and then developed by ACR. There was a suite of them developed in 2015, and then the California Air Resources Board developed it as a compliance offset protocol in 2015. And between then and in about the last 2 years, no credits were generated.
Exactly.
So seeing now the resurgence of this and the focusing on the alternate wetting and drying and creating credits around that's really exciting to see, because there are 3 million acres of rice in the U.S. between California and the Mid-South, and there's lots of opportunity just starting in the U.S. and then expanding globally. As most people know, rice is one of the 3 main crops that almost every person in the world eats at some point during a week.
A lot of history there, which I appreciate from Robert with the Reserve, and some dates of when we publish different protocols that maybe haven't been used or have been used to an extent and then resurface or gain more attention. So I'm kind of pivoting a bit, but I'm curious on some of your thoughts as panelists here on the topic. What is a new project type then? Like rice, alternative wetting and drying isn't new, or landfill gas isn't new, but now they're emerging super pollutant project types. So Elsy, you jump in.
I mean, for us, a new project is issuance.
Sure.
Like,
not a protocol.
yeah, it's like finally a project issue, that's a new project. It's a new methodology. And I think we as project developers in some cases, that's the frustrating part, right? And then the methodologies get upgraded, so some issue after the fact, like they were already in the pipeline, so they're not affected, but the other ones are affected. So it creates backlog in some of the methodologies. So then they turn into new methodologies when we have been talking about it for a very long time. Like there's algae methodology, like we don't have any, or methane-eating bacteria, we haven't had any. So there are things that we talk a lot about, but that we haven't issued credits. So they're really not a project yet.
Right, it's sort of your own definition of what is new or emerging, because if you think of just like, oh, this is a technology or practice change that's possible to reduce emissions, is that new and emerging? Or now there's a methodology or protocol for that practice, now that's new and emerging and development from a registry? Or is it when you see credit issuance that's really when, okay, this has come to market and is an emerging practice type, and then how that scales over time as well, or changes or advances as more technologies or more attention come towards the type. I don't know if you have thoughts on how that's defined.
Well, you see between 2020 and today, there's a dozen new durable carbon removal methodologies. I don't know if it's fair to say we didn't know how to do it, but the methodologies weren't out there and available. And so now we're looking at version 2 or version 3 of a lot of those. The great thing about super pollutants is we kind of know where they are and we kind of know how to take care of them, so we don't have to generate a whole lot of new ideas. The only gap is a funding gap as it relates to financing super pollutants. I've got to guess the next wave of brand new methodologies, if we align carbon removal with super pollutants, it's going to be methane removal or somehow F-gas removal. I do not know how to do that. I don't know if anybody in the room has spent a lot of time on that. I know Spark Climate has, but be really interested to see those come out at some point. But today, I love, investing in the methodologies that we know about as it relates to super pollutants.
I think that's a good segue for a question I think I have for you, Robert, in seeing what methodology or protocols at the Reserve have been developed in its history, and then what we consider moving forward, or what other registries are also looking at. There's obviously a lot to pick from. There's a lot of different practice types, a lot of different, emission sources, super pollutants, nature-based, and then a lot of different regions to apply those practices. How do we prioritize those? How do we determine which ones are market ready from the practice type versus which ones, or as well as which ones are buyers of the market looking for? I don't know if you have thoughts on where we've come from with protocol or methodology development, where we're going.
So in looking at this, it's really, there's been two things, and maybe three things that I see that have really changed the market over the years. The first is the science. So being able to understand the science in many cases unlocks parts of the market. So, for example, the carbon nitrogen cycle is a very complex cycle. The first rice protocol project I actually tried to develop was in California. It was a dry seeding project. So instead of flooding the field, you just wet it a little bit, and then you put on the rice, and then you flooded it up. And so it was supposed to have a large amount of reductions. There was a large amount of acres, and we went to do the calculations, and the organization that was helping with the quantification says it's a net emitter. And I'm like, go back and run the model again. I went back and ran the model again. It's like, Robert says it's a net emitter. I'm like, it can't be. Like, this practice has shown that it's actually reducing methane emissions. What's going on? So I called up the model developer, Bill Salas of the denitrification decomposition model. I said, Bill, take a look at this. Like, take a closer look at it. What the heck's going on? He's like, Robert, they increased the amount of fertilizer they used. And because they're increasing the amount of fertilizer, now you're creating nitrous oxide emissions, and the nitrous oxide emissions increase more than the methane decrease. So starting to figure out like how that actually works, how you apply these, how you use the science, that's kind of the first place that's starting to unlock the market. That's why there are no dry seeding projects. It's alternate wetting and drying because it's much easier, it's much clearer, the reductions are much cleaner. The other side is that the technology is really improving. And these models, it used to be, I was at a meeting one time and someone was running the model and went in, put in all the information, closed their computer and says, well, we're going to know in 24 hours whether or not this worked or not. Now you can actually run those in real time and get the results back, in minutes, if not hours, to get the actual information. And that's been a huge change. We've also, farms, used to have all of their records on paper, right? It was all in notebooks that they had the information. Now they're starting to move to digital technology. As you move to digital technology, that's increasing the ability to be able to take that information and get it into systems. That's why there are actually organizations out there, instead of creating an offset over a year period, they can regenerate them monthly because they're integrated into the systems that a farm has that can collect all of the information that you have and be able to do the quantifications and do the verification and create real-time credit instead of waiting 12, 18, 20 months to be able to generate credits.
Similar thoughts from oil and gas super pollutants as agriculture, or does it change when you look at that sector of practice types?
When we think about building an emission reduction, there's always an emitter on the other side. And in the carbon markets, we've grown very comfortable with that emitter being someone who owns cattle or someone who owns forest lands and is going to harvest their trees, or even someone who owns a landfill. We have not historically gotten comfortable with that emitter being an oil and gas company, even a small family-owned oil and gas company. There's a bit of a different treatment as it relates to that. I think we've started in coal. We're seeing some really successful projects, especially in Southeast Asia, working with owners of coal-fired power plants. So, my hope is that the carbon markets can be leveraged to target the largest, processes that we can change that cause immediate emission reductions. It's important, as with all projects, to think about the adverse incomes or adverse outcome of an incentive. We've got to make sure when we build a project that it isn't going to lead to some, or that we can mitigate emissions traveling elsewhere through leakage and otherwise. But yeah, it's exciting to see the carbon markets expand the realm of parties that they can work with in order to cause change.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, when you're looking at marginal or orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells. It's really in the title of the, if you're thinking of a protocol, it's right there. I led the development for a fairly recent protocol we developed for the cement industry. We call it the low carbon cement protocol. It's had some uptake, and I found it very interesting to learn that fly ash or bottom ash from coal-fired plants can be used as a cementitious material and could be used instead of Portland cement, which is very emission intensive to burn the limestone. And so it's interesting when you start to think of, what waste products can be used in an innovative way, and then optically, are we okay with that, and how are the incentives flowing through an innovative, I guess, sector solution. I don't know if you, Elsy, have any thoughts on that topic of different sectors and just the high-level view of, agriculture versus industry. And, we're talking a lot about super pollutants. That's a good name for them, and they come from different industries or different sectors.
Yeah, because, super pollutants is let's say, what is the biggest bang for your buck, right? And is super pollutants. And, if you can mitigate all the oil, the wells, with all that methane pouring out, but there is a stigma to it. So, yeah, and super pollutants they're not charismatic, let's say. Nature-based solutions are very charismatic. They're like community. They have pictures. It's very marketing photo prone. And super pollutants, like you go to a landfill gas, well, it's not very charismatic. And I think that, like Reid said, there is a stigma in all with the different projects. But I think if you're really thinking about climate, super pollutants is really the biggest bang for your buck.
One of the ways I saw this communicated is that if you think about the monetary value of the present value of damage you're preventing in the future, and you think about, am I going to invest in a proportionate amount of carbon, or am I going to invest in methane and super pollutants? The present value of the damage you're preventing in the future is double by investing in a proportionate amount of super pollutants to carbon. And the price of doing those projects is half of a carbon project. So you're talking about a 4x return on investment by investing in super pollutants. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't protect a forest. Let me be super clear. This is a portfolio approach, but super pollutants have made up 50% of warming thus far. I think the tagline is they should be more than 0% of your portfolio. And we're excited to see new methodologies come out that sort of embrace that perspective.
I heard it say once, let's invest in super pollutants to give the trees the time to grow. That's what I've heard. It has to be all together. It's not just one for the other. It's not removal versus reduction, or it's not super pollutant versus nature-based solution. It's everything that we need to do.
Well, it's interesting too to hear you say about the charismatic, claim of nature-based, but there's obviously a lot of, even though maybe it is optically sounds better, there's a lot of challenges with the quantification, permanence, all of that. Like, in your experience, is it difficult to explain all of the different risks and complexities and uncertainties and unknowns with some of the more charismatic project types, like soils? I'll let Robert answer as well.
Yeah, new emerging technology. We're constantly explaining the different projects to the buyers. We have to say over and over and over again before it clicks sometimes. So when there is a new there is new technologies. We have to learn it first. We need to understand the methodology. We need to understand how it works before we can communicate it to the buyers. So obviously, the marketing materials for a nature-based solution is a lot more, flashy and catchy than, let's say, showing an oil well or showing a DAC project. I mean, it's different. Like, you can have beautiful mangrove pictures, but having a DAC facility is not really very attractive. But it is extremely difficult to communicate all the different technologies to a buyer.
Well, and on the ag side of things, there are so many different variables that go into it. So you've got the crop rotation. You have got what you're doing in between different crops, whether you're doing a cover crop. You've got the form of fertilizer that you're using, whether or not you have a nitrification inhibitor. You've got the soil type. You've got the climate. There's thing after thing after thing, and that raises the uncertainty of the project. And then you've got permanence, right? So even if you get over all of the other part of it and you can show somewhat a charismatic picture of a beautiful cornfield or a beautiful diversified crop rotation or whatever it is, then people are going to be asking about, well, what happens if they dig up the soil and how do you handle that? And I think, where this has really worked, and I've got to credit the folks at Indigo, and Max Dubison is here, and he was one of the people that worked on the reserves protocol, was that you have to do it at scale, right? Those types of, a lot of the ag projects, because the amount of reductions you get per acre are really small, like a 1/4 ton per acre, you've got to do it over lots of acres. And the advantage of doing something like that is that if somebody leaves the program, you can then go ahead and replace them. You can create a buffer pool within a buffer pool, if you will, to be able to address that. So, there's the challenge with some of these nature-based solutions is that they're complicated systems, right? There is some benefit on an oil well, because it's like you can show the rig and you can show this is what we're going to go after. This is the pump that we're going to go after. This is what they look like. Or even if it's something that even a digester type project, you can see the digester cover. You see the flare, or you can see the genset that puts electricity into the grid. So you can see those things. With a lot of these other ones, and I think a lot of the sequestration, the enhanced rock weathering, the biochar, all of those, like, you can't really see it. And so
rocks.
Exactly, pictures of rocks, right, exactly. And so how do you explain that? How do you get people comfortable with that? And if I just riff on enhanced rock weathering, I mean, you're looking at things way upstream, right? You're trying to create the rocks, and then you're putting them on the soil, and then the actual carbon sequestration is way out in the ocean. And so you're talking about this huge system, and like a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. So, we've got challenges going forward in trying to create, explain, and convince people that these are actually really valuable projects and actually have really good benefits, but they're really complex.
So lots of complexity, lots of communication, regardless of the project type. Doesn't make any of our jobs easy. But maybe transitioning a bit into those perspectives then, or like what is of value if a buyer or someone else, is talking about a project type and is asking, what are all the components of what makes this a new, innovative, attractive project type. I assume all the complexities get discussed, but probably also social and environmental benefits. And I've always found it interesting and surprising to learn of some of those social and environmental benefits that come from the industrial work or, super pollutant work, that it's not, sure, maybe the charismatic element of a picture of a rice field or something looks different than a oil rig. But when you peel a layer back and start to talk about social benefits, environmental benefits, that might be a bit different. I don't know, Reid, if you want to speak to your project and some of the co-benefits that you see.
Sure, yeah. I guess 2 points. The first is when we're developing a new methodology or new emerging project type, we can take the learnings from other projects that are out there. We look deeply at IFM as we thought about trying to create behavior change in small and distributed oil and gas companies and little family-owned operators. How do we get them all to join together to make a larger change? So dynamic baselines, separating the emissions calculation from the developer into independent parties so we can corroborate these learnings. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants when we think about creating new methodologies for these project types. As it comes to co-benefits, we've got some easier stories to tell. Like we shut down some wells behind a youth baseball field in downtown LA that were drilled in like 1930. They were venting formaldehyde behind where kids play. We shut down some wells behind an elementary school in West Virginia that put off H2S at 500 parts per million. They had to evacuate the school in the 90s. So oil and gas wells, especially near people's homes, are a problem, and those are low-hanging fruit we can take on. But people live near these high-emission super pollutant sites. People live near landfills. People live near oil and gas wells. People live near places that put off a lot of rice methane. So we have lost to a certain extent in carbon credit, like the face of who's really getting the result of the project. And I think super pollutants has an opportunity to build its narrative a little bit better. I don't know about an adipic acid, program or who's the face of that, but I know that these projects create a lot of jobs. They typically create jobs for the people who live there. These are really high quality jobs. They'll take people who are skilled professionals and retain and retrain them into this specific task. And so you get socioeconomic benefits, you get health benefits, especially in high cancer rate areas. And you help the local community stop emissions where they are. One narrative challenge that we face is a lot of projects get to talk about creating something good. I planted a bunch of trees. Super pollutant projects have to say we stopped something bad. And there's an implicit sort of, for lack of a better word, vibe to that pitch that we're getting more and more comfortable with at the corporate level.
Great. I know, Elsy, this is something you spend a lot of time on and don't just see it from one project type. You see...
Well, on the super pollutant side, I know some of the project developers have come up with very interesting way to have social benefits. I know in Brazil, some of the landfill gases have an educational institute where they bring kids through the institution and they show how they recycle or how they process the garbage and they give kids trees to plant at home or stuff like that. So I know we have one project developer that their organization has an institute. But in general, the super pollutants are you avoid bad smell, you avoid unhealthy situation, you avoid contamination of water, you give high-skilled jobs sometimes in areas where you train people, as Reid said. So that's what you do with super pollutants that you don't see in other, and even insurance, medical insurance in some third world countries.
It's interesting. So, I feel like that brings us back to, okay, well, super pollutants can happen now. They're in large scale. There are co-benefits, social and environmental co-benefits we don't always know about or talk about. Then what is the agriculture or forestry or nature-based side to what is of value then with all the complexities and challenges that you would see?
I think with any type of project, I've been looking at co-benefits for more than 20 years in projects, and it gets really hard to quantify them. Like, we still haven't figured out a good way to do that. The Reserve has got their spreadsheet that has the UN Sustainable Development Goals on them, and it's part of the ICVCM process. But we still haven't found a good way in any type of protocol that I know of to really do a good job of quantifying things. I mean, there's the jobs benefits, there's the local air quality benefits, but all of it comes down to like a narrative. And so I think that's really what to look for in those projects is to and I think that the UN SDGs is a good place to go to, because then you can actually anchor it to something that has some resonance within a lot of the environmental community. But it comes really down to being able to tell that story. So, a grassland project that I worked on had endangered species on it, and just like other projects, they brought school kids out there. They had a lot of things that they could really tell the story about this project that then created that additional value on top of, a grassland project is one that you don't till. So you don't really see any difference between, the day before the project and the day after the project, right? And so you have to create that narrative around it to be able to talk about, this has all these other benefits that it's going to give as well.
Do you agree, Elsy, with that? With the quantification, like in your work, are you quantifying those benefits or finding ways to standardize how you communicate them?
We take those really seriously because they help with sales. So it's important to us to show the co-benefits, because the client is buying a ton. A ton is a ton. That's besides the point, right? So what else is there, right? So for us to we need to show basically our marketing, right? And it's showing all the all the accounting, the carbon accounting is correct. Everything looks good. Well, what else is there? So all the co-benefits, the biodiversity benefits, they can sell the credits.
So that's part of what buyers are looking at then, is not only the project type, not only the emission source, not only the ton is a ton, but what else? Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken with buyers who say that a lot of their best projects started off as community projects and then took on the carbon piece later. I would love it if every carbon project was evaluated on a spreadsheet, like you might think of as bonds or equities, but it's still a storytelling exercise, so the story has to be strong. But with the ratings agencies, with the added scrutiny from the press on projects, can't just be that. The carbon, science, especially in a surplus market, your carbon science has to be absolutely perfect. And and we're talking about new methodologies, every new methodology has got to be better than the one that just got done. It has to come to some greater standard, has to be more conservative, has to issue less credits, has to do more with less. So I don't envy the people who make methodologies in 2030, but maybe that's for the better. That'll break at some point. But today, we're really excited about some of the new things that are coming out, both for their effect and the story that they tell.
I had to laugh because I'm working on drafting methodology protocols with our team, and these are important topics, and it's a good point. How will that be further built into the requirements and the story? I know from a buyer perspective, not only co-benefits, but there still is talk about insetting, or there is insetting happening, or scope 3. There's maybe not only the co-benefits, but is this in my supply chain? How can I claim this? Does that matter for how project types are influenced in terms of what's emerging in the market? I know from agriculture, definitely, or I don't know if you want to comment on that first.
Yeah, it's in-setting is huge. And there's this emerging concept of the right to disclose, the right to report, and the right to claim. So giving you an example of where that's going is that if you have if you put a digester on your dairy and you're the dairyman and you're selling the credits, what rights do you have? Well, you should have a right to disclose it. You have the right to disclose that I have a digester on my farm. You can't claim any of the reductions, but you should claim that you've actually got that digester put in place. If you're the developer of that project, well, you should be able to report about that project. I have created this dairy digester. It has created this number of credits. It's over this number of years. All of the details about it, and then you've got the right to claim. And then you start digging into the right to claim, and you've got the right to claim, and you can claim that up and down the supply chain, right? So if you have a product, if you've got milk that is created by Starbucks, a Starbucks latte drink that is bottled by Pepsi and sold in Safeway, well, all three of those, that's a scope 3 for each one of them. They should each be able to make that same quantification claim, right? But it gets really difficult on that because how do you know who actually gets to claim? Which store gets to claim it? Which branch of a company gets to claim it? And how do you make sure there isn't any double counting in it? And that's kind of the challenges that we're starting to face going forward. But the only way that we can scale some of these things up, especially in the food chain, is to be able to get multiple parties to contribute to it so that you're starting to look at the CI value of a product, and the lower CI value of the product can lower your scope 3 emissions, and everybody that has that scope 3 emissions can make the claim. But this is just the beginning of this journey that we're on.
I feel like dairy is paving the way for a lot of these. I see it in rice as well. You can imagine the complexity in oil. Creating a lower carbon intensity product and then having 1 million people consume it and try to figure out where that scope 3 emission reduction goes is a really interesting task to take on scientifically. But yeah, I every time we speak with someone who's interested in potentially purchasing credits, they want to review whether or not they're going to be able to count this as an inset or some sort of emission reduction against their scope 3. So the more work and more rigor that goes into that analysis will be really, really effective for carbon offset project developers.
Yeah, Elsy, do you agree, or do you see regionality also play a role? Or I know Reid touched on that earlier, the co-benefits in your backyard and the regional component to these things. I could see the supply chain being one benefit, but
yes, I mean it's one of the many issues that we have to, or topics that we deal with clients. It's one of many, right? First of all, is the budget constraint. The prices of the carbon credits and location of the projects and when do they need it and the vintage and there's a complexity in selling carbon credits that is not obvious to many people. I have a client that won't take anything past 2024 behind 20, so it's 24, 25, and 26 vintages. So that reduces my potential presentation, right? Because it's really difficult, especially with issuances these days. So yes, insetting is just one of the many issues that I face or my organization faces when they're selling carbon credits.
That's a lot to consider when thinking about what protocols or methodologies are needed for the market when people have similar views but overlapping perspectives with regionality and supply chain and cost and vintage and credit type and emission source. There's a lot that can influence what's emerging in the market. I do want to save time for questions. I think we have 15 minutes left. But I first just want to give an opportunity for our panelists to say any final thoughts, or maybe I'll put you on the spot to maybe pick a practice type or a region, or summarize sort of where you see the biggest growth, new potential, innovation. No pressure, just your thoughts, and then we'll open it up for questions from you all. So Robert, maybe I'll start with you.
So I think the thing that I've been seeing is the creation of alternative markets and registries. So you're looking at the Pure Earths or the isometrics that are creating their own standards and their own architecture. And I think largely the criticism is the time that it takes for the traditional registries to go and develop a protocol, right? A traditional registry will take 18 to 24 months to create a protocol, where a lot of these other organizations can do it in 100 days or less. There's trade-offs with that. And there's trade-offs within the market on that, but I think there's a lot of interest in going that direction. And so I think we're going to continue to see that going forward. There's a lot of people wanting to drive those new types of practices and do a lot of the work on their own and create a market for that. And we'll see how well that actually turns out. In some cases, I think there are some positives. In some other cases, I think there's some real challenges, because there's an infrastructure around all of that. So to me, that's the thing that I'm seeing a lot of that's happening, is taking a lot of the ideas that are out there and just creating their own standards, their own approaches to it, and their own separate registries, if you will.
I guess from the perspective of new and emerging project types, you have to think about the path for somebody, and I'm saying this a bit selfishly, who's deciding to set out on a brand new project type and methodology within an existing registry. The average timelines right now, and I know Robin talked about making those quicker, but historically, you're 3 to 5 years. You do an initial methodology, it gets turned down, finally you get accepted for a concept note, but that might take 2 years of development. Like, how are you not going to run out of money while you're just working on a methodology for 4.5 years? Only to watch the thing go through right after you fold, and then some big company comes and makes $100 million issuing credits on the methodology you built. So I'm not playing my tiny violin here. We're fine. But I guess to the people considering buying from new project types, like, take the small risk, 5,000 tons, 3,000 tons, whatever it happens to be. Your brand, the fact that you're willing to make that investment, gives them the confidence to continue to work on the project type. It's not necessarily about the finance. It's mostly about trying out a new project type, seeing how the messaging works, going to the site visit, and giving feedback on what you like and don't like about it. Because a lot of the newest project types, the newest methodology developers, are really small and nimble companies who can kind of do whatever they need to do in order to generate the high integrity outcomes that the market desires. So if you're considering new project types, incorporate them somewhat as a distinct piece of your portfolio. I'm going to do some emerging project types with this piece. You might end up finding one that is the best narrative fit and best integrity fit for your organization.
Yes, it is a risk, but I mean, at Cool Effect, we do it. We don't obviously buy a lot, like we tend to buy 100 tons from brand new technology. And unfortunately, we have seen, which is extremely sad, project developers that have gone bankrupt, that we decided to buy 100 or 200 tons. And, they were $600 a credit because they're brand new technologies. So not very many buyers can afford that. And we have seen companies that bought from us like 10 credits of those new technology. We have them on our website, and still it's very little purchase. So it's discouraging to see when project developers go out of business, because they are the ones doing the hard work. But it's the way it is. It's an evaluation of risk, and a lot of companies are risk averse. So.
Well, thank you all. What a challenge ahead of us to figure out how to continue to create this successful pipeline from new innovative technologies and practice changes to the protocols and methodologies that allow or provide avenues for that to generate credits, and then also the buyers and the risk and what happens there and how that influences projects moving forward to get everything to scale in the market. So thank you. I'll turn it over to questions. We have about 10 minutes left, and I already see 3 hands, which is great. I'll go to you first.
I appreciate your time and all of your insights for sure. I have a comment and a question. So on the comment side, I think the way you business is that plugging oil and gas wells, if you've never seen a carbon capture project in fruition, seeing the before and the after is extremely terrifying. Seeing all kinds of leaky oil and gas, leaky salt water, drying carbon shells on the surface, and then coming back a year later after you remove all of that is breathtaking. So, my question is on co-benefits. So, from a project developer perspective, how can we, and Robert, I appreciate your comments here too, and Elsy as well, how can we better quantify all of the co-benefits that come from a particular project, right? So in the case of well plugging, we remove all of the surface equipment, right? We use some downhole stuff, protect groundwater and things like that. But all of the co-benefits that come from the surface are huge. You know, pollinator habitats are revitalized, all kinds of species can be removed. Grasslands and soil can also be rejuvenated after you remove all the surface. So how can we quantify, without just writing a really good story and then repeating that story to buyers, what can we do to put these numbers on a spreadsheet?
I didn't hear the last part.
What can we do to put these things on a spreadsheet to quantify the co-benefit piece? What's like the messaging there?
Well, when we present co-benefits, we tend to say this many jobs were created, this many in rural areas, for example, 50% were women, or, you know, benefits that have co-benefits that has so many endangered species, or we try to quantify what is represented as a co-benefit. So everything, like how many kids are going to school because of it, or how many are girls, how many are boys. We break it down. You can break down your co-benefits into numbers and show the before and the after. So you can do that.
Do you find yourself having like presenting the data on these
Yeah.
benefits that you're finding?
Yes, we presented. We put lots of pictures on it. It's definitely part of the presentation.
With a lot of the co-benefits, it's just really hard to quantify them. There isn't a standard approach. You mentioned pollinator habitats. You know, there have been organizations that have tried to create habitat credits and looked very detailed on it over a number of years, and nothing's really come of it yet. So it's really a real challenge. So I think you have to take the data that's available and quantify it as best as you can, and then tell the story on it. But every project is going to have something different. Whereas, you know, you can, we can start with a ton as a ton on a carbon project, and then you can get down to a category of a project, and there's some through line that you can do all the way. You know, we have the standard categories within a protocol, real, additional, verifiable, permanent, right? We all can recite those off the top of our head. When you get into co-benefits, you know, it gets really difficult. It's really hard to find which ones are there and then to quantify them. And again, every single project is going to be a little bit different. So, I keep looking for it. I've got a project right now where I'm honestly looking at trying how to do that better, and it's still very hard. We haven't cracked that nut yet.
Yep.
Aspiring project developer. I've got a question as it relates to the optics and the disparity of the facts of the supercomputers. First of all, I wholeheartedly agree with the committed transformation with transforming the landscape of the Elsy West Line, oil and gas well site,
Yeah.
So the mention the optics being a problem with potentially subsidizing the oil and gas business for plugging these wells. I've heard a lot of comments from other parties that that's the objective here. But Reid, you mentioned the facts are that, for instance, the marginal wells. By definition, these are marginal productive, marginally profitable, and they're at their end of life, like you said, where the end of life with the emitters, methane emittance spikes, right? So people that may understand that would be buyers like oil and gas companies who understand that those wells will not get plugged. There is additionality. There's no plan. There's no financial ability for these operators to plug those wells. Is there enough demand from potential buyers who understand that don't necessarily mind the optics because they understand, or will it take a change of perspective from, say, like the Microsofts, et cetera, for this project type really to gain traction?
Are you specifically asking about plug-in wells?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. No worries. I think it's always tough to look at carbon credit projects in a vacuum. So I like to think about, the slew of super pollutant project types. It's not as though like a landfill is that more charismatic than like the, shutting down an oil well. When you're dealing in a space in which there is an emitter on the other side that people want to avoid, a landfill, coal mine, HFCs, your science has to be perfect. Your methodology has to be impregnable. You have to get A's, triple A's, double A's on the ratings. You cannot be anything but perfect when it comes to the science, and that's the way to win. So I think that purchasers of credits out there look for the lowest risk option that they can, and I'm speaking in broad brush, so forgive me here, but often very worried about risk, especially with new and emerging project types. So that's why I think you have to de-risk the science heavily. And then, you have to have all the natural conventions in to prevent adverse effects. A forest project that incentivizes a landowner to not cut down trees, they're going to put in a leakage deduction because that person could possibly go and cut down trees elsewhere. There's an argument to be made that anybody who receives an incentive from the carbon markets can take that cash and go create emissions elsewhere, right? So this is not a new concept. There are well-paved paths for it. But, it took 20 years to get the first RED projects together. And we're talking 4 or 5 years into shutting down wells, or really, the first methodology on climate action reserve will be done hopefully soon. So just the longer you're in market, consistently putting out really high-quality projects, that's the way to market yourself and be able to move any tonnage.
Did you want to? At the back, I think there. No, yep. If you have. Oh, sorry. And after. Yeah, go ahead.
Current prevents us from methodologies of mixed project types, stack building. This is something that I have been speaking with folks for years about, most recently in having gone through the process of a couple different project types in mitigation banking on our granulate property. And having to review all those different contractors with all those different developers, segment out what goes here, high value. What truly prevents us currently? Is it a methodological mixed type? Is it the market?
That's a good question. I don't know that we're not pursuing it or thinking about it. It's just very, at least from our perspective at the reserve, really complicated. We have standardized protocols for, say, avoided conversion of grassland, where the activity is you don't till up the land and turn it into agriculture land, but you may also have rotational intensive grazing on that same land, and now you have some stored carbon that you didn't release from not converting it, and you could have incremental removed carbon on top of that, and you could stack something on like a land area. It just gets complicated with the quantification and the ownership and the additionality. You could, I don't know, Elsy, if you had, or anyone else had thoughts on buyer perspectives of different credit types to the question, but that's my response from a protocol development.
Industrially, additionality is probably the biggest challenge. I mean, we saw carbon capture and storage credits on top of 45Q, and it's like, what percentage of that CCS project came from voluntary carbon market versus your tax incentive? I think it's really hard to put a ton into each bucket. Like, I would have done this much of the project, but I wouldn't have done this next ton if I didn't get that extra incentive from that second protocol. But I know that there are methodologies. There are a lot of people working on credit stacking. So I think it's more, it's not an if, it's a when.
Yeah, it's being talked about. And I see we're out of time, so I apologize. I did see a couple more hands. Hopefully you can come up and ask your questions to the panelists afterwards. But thank you again to Elsy, Reid, Robert for their time, and thank you all for joining us. And yeah, thanks.